I am going to allow, not only allow, but invite, I have invited some other speakers who were at annual conference to share some of their thoughts from what they heard and saw. And Jill Pierce and David Bloss are on a steering committee that we have formed here to help us sort through all the information that we are getting, and they're going to begin the sharing. I also asked Pastor Tim and Pastor Joan if they would share, and then I'm going to open it to anybody who was at annual conference, if you have anything to add, and then I'll finish it up, and then we'll move into some questions. Okay? That's the game plan. So Jill and David, you may begin.
Good morning. If you haven't been at annual conference, just let me set the scene for you a little bit. On Thursday, during our first official season, the laity are gathered in Governor's Hall, our home away from home during the days that we are there, and we are gathered with 1,700 of our closest other Methodist friends. They are giving us instruction that first Thursday afternoon, and the clergy are meeting elsewhere. So our delegation is in the back, and if there were a quiz, we couldn't tell you one thing that they said to us in that session because we're all clutching our phones, waiting for the text to come that says, "Joan's in." And eventually, our phones did start to light up, and that set the tone for us because it did indeed say, "Joan's in." And that positive feeling really carried through for us throughout the time that we were there. We saw a lot of positives. There was a lot of hard work done by the bishop and his staff. The Michigan Methodist Federation for Social Action really went above and beyond, making sure we understood the legislation and petitions in front of us, as well as the slate of candidates. We elected candidates to the General Conference and the Jurisdictional Conference that are all progressive, not traditional-minded. And there were a lot of really dynamic young people at the annual conference. They're passionate, they're well-spoken, and they know that inclusion means more than just being nice to people, that everybody needs to be invited to the table and have the same rights. There was also pain. There was pain and confusion. The bishop was very open about saying that he sees a split coming, that we need a split in order to stop hurting each other so much. But for some people, this was hard to hear and hard to understand how this will happen. There aren't a lot of definite answers yet. There's a lot of work to be done, and we're just all praying for the grace to go ahead and perform this work that's in front of us.
Thank you. Before I begin, I have to say, I've always wanted to sit on one of these. Thank you. Thank you. There you go. This was my second annual conference, and one thing I noticed was the difference between what happened in 2018 and the way things happened this time. In 2018, it was a waiting situation. We were waiting to see what happened in St. Louis in January of 2019, and it froze the body. I had seen the same thing. It was my last year as a member of the conference trustees. They were facing a large building decision with respect to the Ministry Center in Lansing. They put it off because they wanted to see what happened in St. Louis and what reaction would be of people, and in fact, how many people would still be considering themselves United Methodists after St. Louis. Froze the linebackers, use a football term. This time, after St. Louis, after the traditionalists unquestionably won everything they wanted to at the General Conference meeting, those who opposed that position, the progressives, were of all things organized and prepared and disciplined. Not something you always see with progressives. If you don't believe me, I give you the Clinton presidential campaign. And as Jill indicated, part of that was constant communications between ourselves and various groups with respect to the status of voting on various resolutions and the candidates for both the General Conference and for the Jurisdictional Conference. We prevailed with respect to all the issues. We prevailed with respect to the conference delegates. I wonder how much the conference delegates, how big a factor that's going to be. It's my understanding, Bob, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that those areas, Africa, the Philippines, which sent the majority of delegates to St. Louis, are going to have an even larger majority in 2020 simply because of demographics. There simply are more and more of them as opposed to us. It's estimated that in St. Louis, 2/3 of the American delegates voted in favor of the one church plan, only 1/3 in favor of the traditionalist plan. It still didn't carry the day. And to show the discipline that the traditionalists had in St. Louis, they had exactly 438 votes, time after time after time, no matter what the issue was. And that was the reason they were so confident going in. It's hard to be that confident going into 2020, but hopefully we'll get a different result with more organization, more dedication, and more discipline. We'll see.
All right. Tim, why don't we start with you and then Joan, okay?
Thank you, David. 21 years ago, I was ordained, and as Bob was saying, it was a much different spirit 21 years ago. The colleague that I was ordained next to, we kind of had a policy where we didn't say much or we didn't talk much. And unfortunately, this colleague had to leave the ministry because of the person that she loved. There's an openness now that I experienced in this conference that surprised me. I cringe still at the way we use our language still is difficult, but I felt that we were able to speak and to also come together, as David said, in a new and a wonderful way. So for me, it was very refreshing. And I did do a lot of reminiscing 21 years ago, today, and hopefully a new way forward will come. So that was very hopeful for me. So it was a good conference, a lot of dialogue and debate, which for me is really hard to cringe through, but I do it. And we had some fun stuff too. We were able to explore with technology how to vote, with using clickers. Boy, you give a lot of Methodist clickers and it becomes complicated, but we made it through. I was surprised at how many people needed to go to the microphone and ask for clarification about a press 1 for yes or 2 for no. But hey, you got to ask the questions in order to make sure you're understanding. So that's good. So it was good, and it was wonderful to be with Bob and Joan for this historic conference, and to be with a lot of colleagues too who have waited a long time.
That text, Joan is in, I was definitely not expecting that. I did not even pack enough clothes to last the whole weekend. So then I had to get some after. But it took a lot to have just enough, I had just enough hope to sort of show up, and then that happened. But during the weeks and months leading up to the conference, whenever I would feel too hopeless to go, or a little bit of anxiety, when I would pray, always the phrase that came to my mind was, "You are not alone. You're not alone." And then in those times I was like, well, I don't know, but it gave me just enough hope. But when we were at annual conference, that you are not alone became really tangibly evident to me in a lot of ways. One was at clergy session. Actually, they ended up voting. They usually vote for each candidate one at a time. And they ended up voting for us as a class of 11, like all 11 commissionees were voted on together. And that was pretty cool. And right before we went up, though, when it had been decided that we were going to be voted on together, I said to these folks, some of whom I just met the day before, I said, well, if things get sort of crazy about my situation, then I'll just step down. I wanted them to be assured that like their future wouldn't be at risk. And they said to me, you can step down, but we'll step down with you. So they were completely, and we all 11 of us like held hands when the vote happened, and it was nearly unanimous, so that was great. But physically and literally I wasn't alone. And then throughout the conference, so many people came up to me to tell me stories how they had worked on, and I'm sure some of you have too, I know some of you have too, have worked on making space for folks like me for 40, 50 years, and that was really cool to hear those stories, like we're not alone. And then also the blessing of being in and now appointed to this community is so wonderful, because I'm not alone, we're not alone. We know now that about 69% of United Methodists in Michigan are also taking they want to be in the same church that's inclusive, that makes space. And so we as a congregation are not alone. So that can give us hope for, I think, some of the still difficult days ahead.
Anybody else? Lori, any, Norm?
Well, Tim, I have you beat by a little bit. It was 52 years ago that I was ordained. Indeed, the atmosphere is far different today than it was then, and I think far better. One of the things that I have found troubling for me personally is language that gets used so much of the time. And the word progressive carries a lot of political baggage that I don't like. And those of us who are progressive really try to see ourselves as being Christ-centered. But if you look back, Christ was a progressive political revolutionary in his day. So maybe it's appropriate after all. And the word traditionalist and traditional, there's really nothing very traditional about the traditionalist stance. It's really steeped more in a sense of fear and bigotry than it is in anything that's really basically traditional. And I'm moving along with the language we have, because that's all we have. And but I just wanted to share that those are my perceptions of it.
So at this vantage point, I'm seeing Leah. Anything you want to add? Here, somebody passed us.
You know, I have been attending the conference for more than 20 years, and this one that we attended was kind of overwhelming for me. I saw a lot of confusion the Thursday. Saturday night, I thought the Holy Spirit was coming down again in force, and I believe that happened because there was a lot of pros and cons about the situation. And I believe the Holy Spirit landed on the conference and gave us light, you know, when we voted. So I still believe in the Holy Spirit, and I still believe in the United Methodist Church. God bless the United Methodist Church.
Naomi, any? I'll get to her.
Thank you. We have a Facebook page that Shara Evie started. I wish I could remember the name of it, but Michigan Uniting Methodists. And on it, we're seeing this kind of progress all over the country. South Carolina, Texas, Florida. I mean, and as well as the East and West Coast, the Midwest. This is not just happening in Michigan. It's happening all over the country. And the other thing I want to say is, you see, I brought those thank you notes today for the bishop. The bishop really has put himself in harm's way to do what he thought was right. So I hope that we will shower him with support, because he's going to get a lot of nastiness. So I hope he's overwhelmed with support during this time.
For those of you who don't know, my name is Naomi Garcia, and besides being a part of this faith community, thank you, I also work for you on the conference staff and have since 1989. When I came in 89, I was just down the hall from the district superintendent of the Grand Rapids district, which is what it was called then, and she said to me something about, what do you think is going to happen with the United Methodist Church and being inclusive? And I said, oh, nothing's going to happen in my lifetime. It's just not going to happen. And I'm delighted to be wrong. I'm delighted. There's two other things I want to tell you as an insider, if you will, as a staff person, because there's going to be versions of it that occur here, sooner or later. It's just a matter of time. One is, for a long time, as you know, Bishop Bard was very neutral in how he spoke of this schism. And it wasn't until March, maybe his third letter about the 2019 General Conference, he said he was leaning toward inclusivity. So for the first time, I had permission from my boss's boss to be intentional about being vocal about inclusivity in the social sense, not just the theological sense. And that was life-giving for me. The other I want you to be aware of, and I might get in trouble for this, but that's the way life goes. There is some anxiety showing up in some of the bosses in the Michigan Conference who are more conservative and supportive of the traditional plan, but nobody's supposed to know that. But we know that because of the way they're treating their staff. And one of the things that's appeared on my screen and then in staff meetings has been kind of like a 5 or 6 point appropriate behavior guide for staff. And it's not, it's more sophisticated language than that. And there's been quite a bit of blowback from me and my colleagues, especially those of us who've been working for some version of the Detroit and West Michigan Conference for years and have never had any kind of a, this is how you're supposed to behave and dress thing. I'm real clear it's about them, not about us, and it's insulting. So part of my work to do to be loving and kind to the 30% who would hurt me if they had a chance, and people like me, I've got to be really clear about creating safety everywhere I go in the way that I create space for individuals to say what they need to say. And in the moment, I'll decide if I feel safe enough to give my point of view. So that now that we are not in the minority in this progressive or whatever we're going to call it, our work is to keep being like Jesus in how we create space without giving up our principles. Because the two are not simultaneous. So I hope you join me in that work. And don't be surprised when it happens, because it's gonna happen. Thanks.
We'll have Mike Conklin say a word.
Well, this was 40th annual conference that I attended, and one of the things that occurred to me all through the weekend, it was a time that was exciting on the one hand because I saw the Michigan conference. I still can't get West Michigan out of my head. I saw the Michigan conference taking a stand for greater inclusiveness, and I celebrate that. Just a week before that, I had been at a memorial service for a friend in the ministry who stood up with me when I was ordained an elder. And I looked around the room, and there were a lot of, because he would not have agreed with my stance. I know that he didn't. We've talked about it. But I looked around the room and thought about what we lose. That I looked around and there are friends in that room that we would stand on different sides of that. But on the other hand, what we gain by being a more inclusive and accepting church is greater than the losses that we experience, but the losses are there too. It came to me as I looked around at annual conference that there were a lot of friends who stood in a different place than I did. And one of the things I don't ever want to lose is the possibility of being friends with them still, even though we stand in different places.
Joe?
Joe Houston, been attending annual conference for I don't know how long. And I just want to bear witness to the courage of our bishop and his tremendous efforts at reaching out to the entire conference, but at the same time being very, very clear about where he was and where he would go, and then his actions at the service of ordination and commissioning. Bishop Bard is a gift, and that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. We are at a painful place for me, for there are long-standing friends whom I did not have the opportunity to greet. There was distance across the rooms which did not get crossed, and we usually made it a point to see one another. And that's intensely painful because the difference is difference of perspective. But I also want to say that the church is in a very healthy place, because what we've been papering over for, well, since 1972 in an official way, what we've been papering over is now very, very much in the open. We can, if we want, to be genuine and honest with one another, whatever our perspectives. And we can, even though it may lead in separate directions, it can lead to us finding a healthy and good way of separating. And I frankly see separation ahead. And that causes me pain. But we are in a healthy and good place. And if we remain steady and faithful, God will see us through. Well, even if we don't remain steady and faithful, God will see us through. God's good beyond anything we could ask or think.
Susan? Nothing? Ken? Anything? Leandro?
My name is Leandro Robles, and we joined the church not long ago. And when we joined, we had a talk with Bob. Do we join now or not? In these times of the church, and split in the times of the church, decided to discriminate on us. And it was very challenging and a battle that we were thinking and struggling in it. But we believed in it. We believed in this First United Methodist Church here. We believed in the love and support that we received since the first day we arrived here. And we joined anyway. Got a text that Joan got ordained, and of course our hearts were really, really happy, and we decided to make that drive to see her ceremony and give us support. So what I saw that Sunday is a church open. It's a church full of energy, and it was reaffirming and wonderful. I'm not naive that it's going to be a lot of work ahead of us, and the split will come. But I also remember that God will never put in our backs something that we cannot handle.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was going to talk about. Let me talk about a couple of things. First of all, the clergy session where Joan was received. What happened was really very, very important in the way they orchestrated everything. The bishop and many of the folks were incredibly well prepared from a parliamentary standpoint. And what happened was that the very first motion that they dealt with was a motion to support the decisions of the Board of Ordained Ministry and receive their report with complete solidarity. And that was our first test of the water, because many of the folks who have tended to be on the side of the traditional language of the discipline decided to use that as the test case. And the overwhelming support of that first motion was telling. I mean, it was significant, 2/3 to 1/3 in the clergy. Then the second was, as Joan stated it, what they did was that they moved to receive all the candidates by class rather than as individuals. That was huge. I've been going to annual conferences for 39 years, and that's the first time in my recollection that that has ever been done. But it was what ended up being very healthy for the church. Each time that language was starting to get divisive, someone would move to call the question. There were ways in which they navigated the potential ugliness to release it from becoming ugly. And in the end, it ended up being helpful to us all, because we figured out now where the Michigan annual conference will fall come decision time, which is probably going to be in the next calendar year. What Bishop Bard also decided to do was that he decided, and he had decided this many months ago, he decided that he wanted to take a straw poll of the Michigan area to see where we would land. And the way he used the language of the test was that he said, if you were to vote today, would you support the traditional language of the discipline, or would you support the language of the one church plan? So what he did was that he went back to the language of General Conference just a few months ago and asked them to decide which way they would do. There was one parliamentary person who tried to dissuade him from doing that. Matter of fact, he stood up and he said, Robert's Rules of Order do not allow for a straw poll. And the bishop listened, and he finally said, but does it forbid us to do a straw poll? And the fellow said, well, no, but I think we need to have a parliamentarian come in here and give us a direction to go. And the bishop said, I'm the parliamentarian. And I say, this is what we're going to do. And that was it. But in my 39 years, and I don't know if my other colleagues here who are clergy who have been for a long time, longer even than I don't ever remember an annual conference that has trusted a bishop the way we have shown trust for this bishop. He got away with several things that were kind of, from a parliamentary standpoint, were kind of shaky. But the people trust him, and they allowed him to steer this not only with incredible grace and kindness, of which he was. I mean, he was just incredibly grace-filled for all of those days. And we ended up in a positive result. Now, what is to come? That is the question that everybody wants to hear. We don't really know what is to come, but the bishops and the Council of Bishops are relatively united that schism is unavoidable. They don't know yet how that will be lived out. But one of the ways that they are going to test that water is to see if they can pass legislation at General Conference to make the United States a central conference. That is something that should, in my view, should have happened many years ago, because we would have avoided the ugliness that we have lived through these last 10 to 12 years. But they're going to test that to see if we can do a central conference in the United States. There are other entities within the church that are working to see how schism may play itself out. There is a group that is being gathered by Adam Hamilton, who is a large church pastor in Kansas City. Just a few weeks ago, there were 10 people that were invited from each of the annual conferences in the United States. So they had about 600 people there. And they worked diligently to start the process of creating a pathway for the division between the traditionalists and I agree with Norm, the language is a barrier for us right now. The traditionalist means, in the language of the Book of Discipline, it means that they support the language where a self-avowed practicing homosexual cannot be a clergy person. And that's what was approved at General Conference. So a traditionalist, in the language of the discipline, that's what that means. A progressive in the language of the discipline says we've got to get rid of all the language that divides us and degrades the LGBTQ community. There is a whole breadth of persons in United Methodism that are in the centrist category, where there are some things about United Methodism that they love and appreciate and don't want to lose. And yet, because of the nature of what happened at General Conference, the centrists have now started the move toward the progressive side. And just as Lori said, it is a movement that, I mean, if you were reading the press releases from the General Church, it is incredible what is happening all across the United States, where folks are being elected to become delegates at General Conference that want the language of the discipline to change. And so we are in a time of anxiety, but incredible possibility. And I think it is a good move, and I'm in a different place today than I was 2 weeks ago. Because I saw a stance that the Michigan area took that I didn't know. I didn't know whether we would get there. But we are there. And it was clearly 2/3 to 3/4 on every vote. Okay? So, questions? Anybody have questions that we can? Yes.
The bishop at the ordination service several times said, "Isn't this amazing? We have this many new clergy coming in at a time such as this, a time of conflict and turmoil, and yet they keep coming forward." To me, that says the Holy Spirit is really, really active in this denomination.
Okay. Questions from any of you? Comment? Go ahead, Dale.
We were the conference delegates for many years. It was boring as sin. Now they have all the fun and we're not there.
I didn't think you would ever say that sin was boring.
Yeah, it's as boring as I don't know what.
I cannot believe that it's just happenstance that today is Pentecost Sunday. And this whole morning, I have felt like a new church is being born. And it was an incredible service around that message. Thank you.
What else? Come on, folks. You've been antsy to ask some of these questions. Let's.
If you'll bear with me, this is probably a really stupid question. But as a teacher, I was told there were no stupid questions, so I'll ask it. Given what happened in and I'm thrilled for Joan. I think it's wonderful. But given what happened in St. Louis, how can the Michigan Conference vote to ordain her by themselves?
Well, let's deal with that. There are two things that play into this moment in time. One is that we are still under the discipline of 2016. And the language that they adopted in St. Louis does not go into effect until January 1 of 2020. So this is a short window. But the window also means that the bishop and even Joan could be charged with violating the discipline, even as it stands. And in fact, there have been charges that have been brought, but based on the language, the current language of the discipline, the decision of how to navigate those complaints lies with the office of the bishop solely. And the way in which the current language of the discipline is, the bishop has the right and the responsibility to try to get to a just resolution without punitive interference. And so he will deal with whatever the complaints are under the umbrella of the current book of discipline, which gives him latitude to process those complaints in a just resolution process.
Thank you.
Okay?
Yep.
Is that helpful? Does that help you understand? Because I'm sure we're not done with this, not by a long shot. There will be complaints that will be filed. Bob? Yeah, just a second. Sammy's got the mic.
A lot of this happened in St. Louis while we were still in Texas. The perspective of our pastor in our church in McAllen was very much similar to what we are experiencing here today. And I have a sense from my past experience in the Northern Illinois Conference, having gone through one of these trials, and the discipline was followed in that case, but a year later the bishop wiped that slate clear. But I have a hunch that throughout the country there are a lot of conferences that are looking for leadership, such as our bishop has expressed. And I have a hunch when it comes right down to it, no one wants to divide. And I have a hunch that the idea of creating a United States conference, then we will have a much better sense of going forward and maintaining unity, but in a progressive manner.
That you're to be applauded for your hopefulness. Okay, and bless you for that. I think many of the things that you just said are accurate. We are looking for leadership, particularly from our bishops. The unfortunate thing, and I believe this is the one thing that is exciting to me about the possibility of dividing and starting over, is to fix some things about our polity that are inconsistent with the 21st century. There are ways that we do business in the church that need to be rethought. And we can't deal with some of those weighty issues that are holding us back because we have been so consumed for so long about the fight over LGBTQ inclusion that we haven't done the due diligence to keep the church vital and vibrant in ways that needs to happen. And one of those is that I think it's absolutely absurd that the bishops of the church cannot do anything at General Conference except preside. They cannot speak. They cannot give leadership except through parliamentary process. In my view, tell me one of your business organizations where the president of your business is silenced at the most important juncture of decision making. And that's what's happened. It needs to be rethought. In the old days, it was, in their mind, it was a check and balance thing. That the bishops could not speak for the denomination. And while I get that in old language, tell me one organization where there is no spokesperson for an organization in over a 4-year span, okay? Because what happens is that General Conference meets every 4 years, and the church only speaks as an organization every 4 years. That's idiotic. It makes no sense.
Bob, I'm not as afraid of a split as a lot of people are. The Methodist history has been replete with splits that have come back together, that have done different directions, all that kind of thing. The thing I'm afraid of is a splintering. That all of a sudden we will have, instead of 2 Wesleyan-based denominations, 5 or 6. I think the splintering would weaken us incredibly, and to have different people kind of taking leadership in different parts of the country, somehow we have to bring some of that together as we talk about the possibility. But a splintering, I think, would be disastrous for us. And that's one of my base fears.
Okay. And well put. Well, we are at 10 minutes after 12. We're going to quit. One of the things that I want to say is that I appreciate all the delegates and all the ways in which they got involved. And I'm going to ask them to stand one more time just to be recognized by the congregation, because they did a wonderful, wonderful job. All right. Grace and peace to you. Thank you for coming.